So last panel. Oh, good. We have the lights on. We're going to go from. We should be done with this by 5:30, a little bit earlier, to give you guys some rest until tomorrow. But I warned you, it was not going to be a soft ride. We were going to be not tough on crime, but tough on you guys. And appropriately, our last panel is going to be on things you've been hinting at up till now throughout the day, which is juvenile justice, law enforcement, changing cultures, changing minds, which is kind of a good way of saying that. And to lead us through it, we're pleased to have Shawn Marsh, who is the director of the Judicial Studies Graduate Degree Program and the professor of Judicial Studies at the University all the way from Nevada in Reno. And he oversees the nation's only program which offers both a master's and PhD degree in Judicial Studies exclusively for sitting judges. And you can read the rest of his really interesting bio in your packages, so I'll turn it over to Shawn, and we can start over.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, we're good to go. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're enjoying your day. I am indeed Shawn Marsh. I'm all the way from Reno, Nevada. Again, my bio is in there. I will add to that I spent a good chunk of time working in juvenile justice direct service, typically with deep end youth. Later on in my career, I worked as the chief program officer for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, where I oversaw their juvenile law work, both on the child welfare and juvenile justice side of things. I would end, before I ask Heather and Naomi to introduce themselves, that my work in recent years as a researcher and professor at the university has focused on two major areas. One is an implicit bias and how that impacts law enforcement, thinking through how it plays out with judges and judicial decision making. And the other, which I'll talk a little bit more about, is trauma responsive justice and what that means from first point of contact, which I think both Naomi and Heather might touch a little bit on, all the way up through and including judges. So that's kind of a little bit of my background and what I'm working on currently.
Hi, everybody. My name is Naomi Smoot. I'm the executive director of the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. We're a national nonprofit that works with state advisory groups, governor-appointed bodies in each state and territory that administer federal juvenile justice at the state level. So we work with them on policy improvements, including around police and youth relations.
Hey everyone, I'm Heather Renwick. I'm legal director at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth in Washington, D.C. I'm particularly excited to be here because I feel like I've talked to so many of this wonderful class of fellows on the phone before or over email, and so it's wonderful to meet you in person. The Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth works to end extreme sentences for kids in the criminal justice system, and so I'll be talking more about the judges, prosecutors, and parole board members and their interaction with kids who commit serious crimes.
Okay, so to set the foundation, and I understood that earlier today there was a lot of talk about trauma-informed care and some of the attention paid to the work of folks in the justice system around trauma issues. And we had chatted previously about how to set the foundation for this particular talk. And it really was kind of focused on some of that trauma work. But I don't want to kind of beat it to death if you've already had some of that. So I'm going to do an accelerated version. And since we started a little bit late, we'll kind of dive into the questions a little sooner than we had anticipated, and then obviously have a chance for back and forth. But from my perspective, this movement or efforts to incorporate what we know about trauma-informed care into the justice system at all points of contact is a bit of a game changer. And really, in 30-plus years of doing this work, it's the first time I feel kind of really grounded and rooted in science is actually touching the applied work that we do in the justice system. Now, really, what's happened over the last decade in particular, and a lot of this work started with someone you saw earlier today, Dr. Dierkeising, who I've worked with for about 10 years on this issue, is it's kind of pushing this pendulum away from social control back into social welfare. Now, I can't say categorically across the board that that's the case, but we're seeing little pockets of movement in the juvenile justice system. Not unusually, the justice system is the last one to the dance. Courts are often a little bit behind schools, education, business, other folks that are doing this work. And we're seeing really promising stuff coming out of schools, for example, in residential care around trauma-informed work that we're trying to extrapolate and work with courts to implement. But just as a little bit more of a background, if you think about the populations involved with the justice system, you can make some assumptions. And we know the statistics bear out that roughly 6 million plus cases a year of violent victimization in the United States. Now, by definition, a lot of those folks, either as victims or as offenders, are going to come in touch with courts, with law enforcement in some way. So right out of the gate, we're assuming that a lot of folks touching the system have experienced some sort of adversity, substantial adversity, or trauma. Within that, if you make that assumption, what the system is designed to do is actually the exact opposite of what folks that have substantial adversity and trauma need. What our system is set up to do is to tell people what to do, is to take control of their lives. What we know from the research is that those with substantial adversity and trauma need to reestablish a sense of control in their own life, make their own decisions, experience agency. And I mean everyone touching the system, including the juvenile justice folks. So right out of the gate, we're asking systems and courts to fundamentally shift their worldview around how to work with folks. I can tell you, having worked for judges for a long, long time, it is not well received when I come into a room full of judges and tell them that they have to be willing to give up some control. They like control. They like to make decisions. That's what they're paid to do. We are having success in doing that, and maybe the back and forth will kind of lead into some of that discussion moving forward. But really what I talk with courts and with police officers, and I've done this work with school safety, resource officers, just about everybody you can imagine, is to really adopt more of a public health orientation to this very large population. Again, with the assumption most coming through the front door have this history of adversity or trauma. And what a public health model does right out of the gate is removes this victim-offender, sick-well, et cetera dichotomy, which as human beings we're very fond of. You're either one or the other. What public health does is say you can be completely comfortable with both and. You can very well be a victim and an offender at the same time. You can be sick and well at the same time. It just depends on the dimension that you're interested in. So what does that mean? Well, what we've boiled it down to is that if you can encourage a sense of safety, which folks that have adversity and trauma histories desperately need, they need to feel safe. They need to feel heard. A lot of procedural justice types of issues come into play. Second of all, they need in each and every opportunity possible to have agency. That's to make decisions about their own lives. Why is that important for folks that have had traumatic histories? Because they were fundamentally violated. Something happened to them at such a level that it was life-threatening in the case of trauma or in the case of adversity, something that folks just wouldn't want. But it's forced upon them. They didn't have a choice. So we're trying to teach folks in the system to make choice possible at every step, at every point of contact. This can be very subtle things. I tell judges, as for example, give the party in question a say in when the next hearing is going to be held. You would be amazed at how many hearings I've sat through. They'll ask defense counsel, they'll ask prosecution, they'll ask the clerk of the court. If certain date and times work, they're missing a really important person there, the party that has to be in court, right? So just that, say, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, does this work for you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's hugely powerful statement from a judge to do that. We also talk and teach that to be very mindful of introducing safety, agency, and the third, I passed it right over. The third, by the way, so safety, self-determination, or agency. The third one is support, social support, because we know adversity, trauma, involvement in the system is very isolating. We want to see that across domains. We want to see that at an ecological or environmental level. In other words, take the time to make residential treatment, detention, courts, police stations, whatever the case may be, user-friendly, navigable, less stressful. You've probably, if you're ever spending time in courts, you've probably come across very stressful, loud, chaotic, don't know where to go, bailiff shouting cases. Sometimes you have accused batterers submitting with the potential victim from the night before. I mean, just some of these environmental considerations that when you stop and take a breath are no-duh sort of considerations. But we're teaching folks to think through that lens. So environment, practice, policy, and last but not least, persons. And I emphasize persons because in this model, in our thinking, and this will play in, I think, with some of the law enforcement, is that every point of contact, each and every point of contact, when a kid comes in touch with the system, whether it's law enforcement, probation, courts, detention, youth corrections, whatever it is, every one of those has an opportunity to promote healing. And what I encourage folks to think about in terms of adversity and trauma, you've heard the saying, death by 1,000 cuts. Well, it's injury by 1,000 cuts, and healing is through 1,000 Band-Aids. And the way to look at 1,000 Band-Aids is the security guy wanting you coming through the front door. It's the judge, it's the probation officer, it's the law enforcement. Every person has an opportunity to promote safety, self-determination, and to provide support. So that's a really quick tour of some of the thinking we've had around the work of trauma-responsive justice, and ultimately the research is bearing out pretty strongly so far that this is not only good for kids or those that are kind of being consumers of justice, it's really good for those that are administering justice. So we see things like less sick leave being taken, people staying on the job longer. I work with a jurisdiction, the average length of stay for a new social worker in child welfare is 3 months or less. Okay, something isn't working, and one way to do this is make it so that folks feel supported and feel healthy and are able to do this. So good for consumers and good for administrators. And there's a lot of work to do, but I think we're starting to see it. We're starting to see the research coming out of courts and law enforcement, schools, hospitals, the whole 9 yards. But it's extremely promising. And with that, I'm gonna end just on a point that I hope we can revisit, and that's the issues of disproportionate minority contact in the system, where non-white folks are overrepresented in the justice system is pretty much the nuts and bolts. And I promote and I suggest to you that this trauma-informed movement or trauma-responsive justice movement is a diversity, inclusion, and DMC issue. Why? Well, very simply, if you think about a court, and I tell courts this all the time, if your court does not look like the community it serves, people will never feel fundamentally safe in that court. We see it happen a lot where you go into a court and it's 99% white, and they have an 80 to 90% African American or Hispanic, et cetera, consumer, right? I challenge you to think that through in terms of how you would feel if that was you coming in to receive justice or to receive hearing, or if you run into law enforcement. It really is important to address at both ends because, again, this idea of DMC and diversity inclusion ultimately is about trauma-informed care as well. So. With that, I want to turn and hear from both Naomi and Heather, and we'll start with you, Naomi, if that's okay. So in your work, you've been focused, in part at least, on this relationship between kids and law enforcement, right? So maybe you could start by telling us a little bit some of the challenges that you're seeing in doing that work and the challenges you see in those relationships, and then perhaps what can happen to make that better?
So I think it's no surprise to anyone in this room that law enforcement and community relations are strained, to put it mildly. Our piece at the Coalition for Juvenile Justice in trying to address that has been for the past 3 years, working with law enforcement through the International Association of Chiefs of Police and recruiting young people, in addition to law enforcement, to hold roundtables where we really get into the meat of what's going on in communities, what's the breakdown in these relationships. And one of the things that we're hearing time and time again from the young people who participate in these events is, you never asked me basic questions, right? To go back to your point about, like, what time can I be in court? Why did I run away from home, right? What's going on that put me on the street when you found me? What's going on that caused me to not go to school when you found me out there? Some of those baseline questions aren't getting asked. Another thing that we see that's often hard to try to have to explain to the law enforcement themselves and to the young people is that law enforcement aren't required in many states to be trained on how to interact with young people, right? So they have to go through a basic training curriculum, and it has a lot of very strict requirements. But in terms of how to actually interact with young people, with minors, and with those 18 to 24-year-old folks who are entering adulthood, there isn't a lot of concrete, specific training around that piece. And that's really important because we know that young people are very different than older adults, right? If you come into contact with someone who is not yet 24, their prefrontal cortex hasn't fully developed, they're still more likely to engage in impulsive behaviors. It's a different interaction than it is when you're interacting with someone who's in their 30s or 40s or 50s. One of the other things that we see as part of these institutes that comes up pretty repeatedly is just trying to agree on some common rules, right? Law enforcement come into a situation with a level of authority and a level of power that young people don't have. It's a different power dynamic. So we've had to work with them to try to understand that just coming and talking is important. Not always having a weapon on your person is important. And especially if you're going to have a conversation and sit down with a young person, getting that weapon out of the equation is critically important. There was a comment earlier about homelessness and the disproportionalities that exist there. And I think that's critically important to highlight. As CJJ, we have what are called principles for change that highlight ways that communities can address those intersections between juvenile justice and youth homelessness. Because nationally, what we're seeing is about 78% of young people who identify as homeless have come into contact with law enforcement. About 44% have spent some time in a jail or detention facility, and that's hugely disproportionate to the number in the general population. Chapin Hall has done some really great research around that issue and found that those numbers are very large. And one of the key pieces there can be just as simple as it's 11 o'clock, right? Your city has a curfew, it's 11, all kids have to go home at 11. Well, if I don't have a home to go home to, I'm automatically criminalized now at 11 p.m. Thinking through some of those things so that law enforcement doesn't have to automatically criminalize someone just for a lack of housing. I also would talk about, to your point earlier, Shawn, around DMC. Law enforcement is the first person to come into contact with a young person often. Right now, all states are required to collect data around racial and ethnic disparities, right? What are the numbers of kids coming into contact with their system? We're seeing a situation where the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, back in June, announced a new plan where instead of 9 points of contact, they now have 5 points of contact, but you only have 5 points from which you can choose 4 to collect data on. And that can be hugely impactful in communities, right? Another piece of this plan is requiring that states place their plans for DMC on public websites. And that's really important and critical, but that requires that the public keep account of what those plans are saying, right? And I think that's a place where you guys, as journalists, can play a really big role as we move forward. I'm going to turn it over to you in just a second, but I think one other interesting piece to tie back into that, we also see a situation where the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, the main federal legislation on juvenile justice, is about 99.7% of the way done. We are very close to reauthorization for the first time in 12 years. And that act would put some teeth into racial and ethnic disparities and addressing racial and ethnic disparities that we haven't seen in older iterations of the act. So I think it's really critical that those two pieces are coming into play at the same time.
Just a real quick follow-up, if you don't mind. When you were talking about training around adolescent and understanding teenagers, do you see that improving as far as training with law enforcement, or is it still, are they incorporating that specific kind of training for police?
So I think there's a growing awareness that it's needed. I don't know that we've gotten to the point where it's increasing.
The reason I asked is I took no pleasure in asking a group of about 500 juvenile probation officers a number of years ago how many had ever received any training in human development. I had 5 hands go up out of hundreds, and then I asked how many people had training on adolescent development, and I had 1 hand left up out of hundreds. And these are juvenile probation officers. So your point is well taken. It's definitely desperately needed. Heather, to you, a similar question, but I know your point of focus is a little bit more the deep-end youth and fair sentencing, those types of things. So, what kind of challenges are you seeing in the work that you're doing? And then, are the challenges and the attitudes from administrators of justice consistent with what we know about developmental science, adolescent development?
All right. So I just want to take a minute before I address the challenges to highlight and underscore the success of the past 15 years. We've talked now 3 or 4 times today about the wave of decisions out of the Supreme Court from Roper, Graham, Miller, and most recently Montgomery. So we went 15 years ago from being able to constitutionally execute a child to now where no child can be sentenced to a mandatory life without parole sentence. Before a child can be sentenced to life in prison, no opportunity for release, the sentencing judge needs to take into account the totality of who that child is. What is his lived experience? What's his family like? What was his interaction with the police? What were his inabilities or challenges navigating the prosecutors or the other, just the legal system generally? What was his family history? Were there adult co-defendants? Like, let's paint the whole picture of who that child is. That's what the Supreme Court said in Miller and Montgomery. And as journalists, please don't report that the Supreme Court banned life without parole for children. If I had a nickel for every time I read it, I could retire right now. The Supreme Court said that only the rare or uncommon child can be sentenced to a lifetime in prison. And I want to highlight this because it's an incredibly difficult standard to implement, and it's what's created some of the challenges that we're currently facing. So the court said that if your crime reflects transient immaturity, so if you can arguably grow up and outgrow your antisocial behavior, it's unconstitutional to sentence you to life without parole. If your crime reflects irreparable corruption, so if someone can deem you at 16, 17 years old incapable of positive change, there's a world in which you can still be sentenced to life without parole. That's the constitutional framework we're working in. The challenge with that is no clinical forensic psychologist, nobody can predict who's going to outgrow antisocial delinquent behavior and who isn't. Because what we know, as we've talked about over and over again today, is that all kids are capable of positive change. You're in a developmentally sort of like flux time in your life, and likelier than not, you're going to outgrow that antisocial behavior. And so we're in a strange constitutional posture now where prosecutors are charged with discerning which kids are going to outgrow their behavior and which aren't, and then seek life without parole in those cases. It's an impossible situation that they're in. It's impossible. So I would argue that no prosecutor should be seeking life sentences for children because no prosecutor is able to divine which kids are going to outgrow their antisocial behavior and which aren't. But I do want to acknowledge that those Supreme Court wins are hugely significant and have resulted in the release of hundreds of people, and I can talk a little bit more about that. But then we've also seen tremendous legislative reform in the past 8 years, really, 6 years even. So when Miller was decided in 2012, only 5 states banned life without parole sentences for kids. Today, 25 states in the District of Columbia ban life without parole sentences for kids or otherwise don't employ it, never sentence a kid to life without parole. It's a remarkable shift in a very short amount of time. So between the Supreme Court decisions and the rapid rate of state legislative change, our country looks incredibly different than it did just 10 or 15 years ago. But none of those reforms are self-affecting. We have to implement them. And that means we need defense attorneys and prosecutors and judges and parole board members to understand why the law has changed, believe that it should change, and then enact it, live it out. And that's where we see the challenges coming up sort of at every juncture of this system. Because we have progressive prosecutors like Larry Krasner and Kim Fox, who we talked about earlier today, who really believe that kids are capable of change and that kids are constitutionally and developmentally different, and have really led their offices in more age-appropriate sentencing. And then we have prosecutors in other jurisdictions who really believe that kids who commit homicide should spend the rest of their lives in prison. And I want to reiterate something that Vinny said earlier, which is that we have such a hard time understanding how out of step we are with the rest of the world in our sentencing practices. How many of you listened to the first season of Serial with Sarah Koenig? Yeah. Okay, so it's the story of Adnan Syed. Sarah Koenig, an incredible investigative reporter. I thought she did a tremendous job of both giving facts and storytelling, and it was a really compelling narrative. The question that nobody ever asked or contemplated was, even if Adnan was guilty, is sentencing him to a lifetime in prison the appropriate penalty? Nobody ever asked that question because it's so normal to us. Technically, Adnan is parole eligible after 10 years, but he's serving in Maryland where nobody with a life sentence is paroled, right? We're so embedded in this framework of incarceration that we never take a step back to ask, is this appropriate? And so I think we see this with both prosecutors and judges, because if they've spent their entire careers prosecuting cases, especially homicide cases, and their understanding of justice, as they've always been told, is either someone gets death or life without parole or some extraordinarily long sentence, it's really hard then to say just because kids are different, that those kids shouldn't be held accountable in a very significant way. And so I think that's a lot of the challenge that we're facing. Is it's a real paradigm shift. I mean, it's asking a lot of everybody in the system to go from thinking this kid should die in prison to this kid should have a meaningful opportunity for release and have an opportunity to come home and contribute to the community. Sorry, I could keep going for a long time, but you may have more questions for me.
I do. I have a couple follow-up, but I wanted to jump on the in comparison to other country point. I routinely meet with groups from all over the world that are brought to the university where I work by the State Department, and it's to learn more about the American justice system. And I've been doing this probably 10 years or so. In the last year, I've had Zambia and Israel and Kosovo and the whole 9 yards. And one consistent theme across these groups, and their judges, prosecutors, attorneys, defense counsel, is they think we're nuts. They think the U.S. is nuts. And they ask questions about, well, what do you do with kids that do this? And they look at us like we just fell off Mars, right? They have no sense of why in the world we do what we want to, what we're doing to try to correct behavior. One way to think of it is to look into some of more of the restorative philosophies. Kind of my sense for the most part internationally, and I've done some work in Germany, is it's much more of this kind of grab and bring in, where our system, particularly the juvenile justice system, is carve them out and push them away. Fundamentally different viewpoint. But I appreciate you starting out with this idea of what are we doing right, and I wanted to see if Naomi, you had some thoughts on.
Can I say one more thing about the international context, but then pass?
Yeah.
So I just wanted to say the United States is the only country in the world that sentences kids to life without parole. We're the only country that does it. And in Europe, the average or the maximum sentence for kids who commit homicide or really any offense is usually about 10 years. Like, that's the outer limit. And right now we're going from a world where we celebrate when someone is eligible for release after 25 years or 30 years or 40 years, right? Like our framework is just, we're off by decades from the rest of our counterparts.
Keyword being eligible, right? Just right, even eligible. That. So what are you seeing in your world, Naomi, that's being done right?
So what I see that's being done right is youth collaboration. It's not just a movement that's led anymore by a bunch of folks with fancy degrees. It's really a movement where people with lived expertise are getting involved and getting engaged and leading the movement themselves. We have a youth panel that we work with at CJJ. 2 of our young people are still incarcerated, and they meet with us via webinar, and they advise us on our policies, they help us with our publications, and then we also got the chance, again through our police and youth engagement work, to work with a group of young men called the EVAC Movement in Florida. They have met with President Obama, they've done all sorts of fantastic advocacy work, and they came up with the curriculum for their class on their own. They're a group of young men who were at Hope Youth, and they have just really sort of taken the lead on working in their community to try to change things. The 2 young men that I mentioned that we work with who are still incarcerated worked with Washington state legislators last year to revamp their laws. Even though they're currently behind bars facing extremely long sentences, they made sure that they got the laws changed so that the next group of young men who are coming up don't face those sort of tough sentences that they faced for unnecessary things. So I think that's one of the best things that I see happening, is that it's not just, I can sit up here and say what people should do all day, but people with lived expertise, like who can actually say that's going to work or that's not going to work from a real perspective.
That's a really good point, and that movement of involving youth and providing a voice, again, going back to where we started, is very much also a trauma-responsive issue. And to your point about adolescent development, it's a recipe for disaster when you introduce into the forming brain these adversities and these traumas. Just from my point of view, some of the things that we're doing right, in addition to trauma-informed courts, and by the way, I should mention specific, if you're interested in more information about that, in Arizona, you can contact me. There's courts that kind of rebuilt everything from the ground up around a trauma-informed lens. And some great work out of Florida with a couple judges, A to Z, again, revamping everything, policy, practice, the whole 9 yards, and we're seeing some real interesting projects there. In fact, the court in Florida I'm thinking about, they're actually raising money to build a school for the kids that come through the juvenile justice system, come through that court, that is attached to the court so that they can maintain this trauma-informed care fluently through the kids. Two other big things, and one kind of ties in with the trauma, is we've made progress on shackling kids in court. And sometimes we forget to celebrate the small victories, but not, until very recently, it was not uncommon that kids, for even on the truancy docket, would be led in chain gang together in full shackles. We've made progress. And then some of the raise the age stuff, which I see is on the agenda. I think tomorrow is when I saw it. So real quick question. I know there's some follow-up. We've got just one-liners left before we have the Q&A, but I would ask you both, and either one can start, if you were queen for a day, what's the one thing you would change immediately to improve the juvenile justice system? What's your biggest bang for the buck? Flip a coin?
So I think, again, going back to what we were just talking about a moment ago, racial and ethnic disparities, we need to address that. We need to make that a priority in this country. And it is, right? I've been at CJJ for 5 years. I've been our executive director for 2. And the whole time I've been there, the states have been saying, we want to address this. We need to address this. Help us address this. And I think that is the biggest bang for our buck.
If I could wave a magic wand, no child would ever be considered an adult. I don't think there is no such thing as an adult crime that a child can commit. Children commit crimes and adults commit crimes born out of their individual lived experience, what's happening in their lives and in their world. And so I think it's a mistake to ever adultify anybody. Certainly we do it to kids of color constantly in every aspect of life. But I think this just notion that some offenses automatically mean that that kid is an adult is just a mistake, and it sells those kids short.
Well, I completely agree with both of those. I would throw in my 2 cents, which is relevant for this group. Additionally, it's just really accurate public education, right? Through journalism, through training, through college, whatever it might be. It's really important, law enforcement and courts and judges and whatnot. But if the public doesn't have good information, they don't understand the realities, the reactionary nature of the system will lead to things like the super predator myth, which was completely driven by the public, right, and their understanding of the dynamics. So that would be my wish for the day. So I think we're right about it on time, and this is where we were going to have some Q&As.
Yeah, I have a question first. I'd like you to address the question of cultural change within the law enforcement agencies that are a big block towards making progress. What does your experience and your insights tell you about how to go about that?
Can I answer first?
Go, please.
So I can't answer to law enforcement because I don't work with law enforcement at this point in my career, but I do work with parole board members and prosecutors and judges.
Okay,
and
so that's part of my question.
Okay, great. So the single most impactful means of engagement is the leadership of directly impacted people. A quarter of our staff were incarcerated as children convicted of homicide offenses and served between 15 and 30 years, each of them. And we have a network of formerly incarcerated youth, our Incarcerated Children's Advocacy Network, all of whom are, served decades in prison for homicide offenses and are out. They lead the charge in our state legislative advocacy. They train judges, they train prosecutors, they train parole boards. And I have seen parole boards flip the way they operate and go from assuming that kids who commit serious crimes are bad apples, and that's particularly prevalent in the parole space because a lot of the risk assessments that they use penalize youth at the time of offenses as a risk factor. But I've seen them in the span of 2 weeks change their posture towards youth who commit serious crimes by virtue of having interacted with formerly incarcerated youth and hearing their stories and better understanding their lived experience. And I know Jessica made that point in the last panel, but I cannot overstate. I mean, we are experts in one way in the law, and folks who have lived through the system are equal experts in a different way, and their voices matter the most in terms of shifting cultural practices and norms at any of these institutions.
So I think for law enforcement officers specifically, getting to the police chiefs themselves, the person who's in charge of the agency, so that they can help shape that culture and pass it down through the ranks. And again, just to reiterate, getting to meet people who you're actually interacting with, who are coming in contact with your system. At our police and youth engagement institutes, we consistently see that it starts with sort of a us and a them, right? And by the end of the institute, it's really fantastic to see that you have really great bonds that are forming. And when I say really great bonds, I mean like some of these guys are staying in touch with each other 3 years later. And, you know, I think of a moment where I got on a bus to do a head count and I was like, okay, all my guys raise your hands. And every person on the bus, chiefs, kids, everybody raised their hands. So I think having those conversations can really change the way people see each other.
Absolutely. Chief of police, and if they don't want to play ball, get a judge on your side. Because when a judge calls a meeting, everybody goes, period. And that's kind of my intervention point, is to convert judges into our way of thinking and then turn them loose on their community. And it works. It works really well.
Okay, questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Josh Vaughn with the Sentinel in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. So how do you guys frame the discussion when you're talking to either formally or informally victims' rights organizations? Because they obviously have a very outsized voice, especially when it comes to the legislation that would be needed to make some of these changes.
Do you want to start?
I was going to say, I would caution against assuming that victims and survivors of violence have a uniform perspective on accountability. I think we often do them a disservice by assuming that they all feel the same way and that their feelings about accountability remain static over time, when in fact, I think most survivors of violence or victim family members sort of evolve or change, or their feelings ebb and flow over time. And I think especially around issues of youth who commit serious crimes, I think the key is to acknowledge that the harm caused is the same, regardless of whether the person who caused it was a child or an adult. The harm, the impact, the irrevocable change in that person's life is the same. What is required by us, by the Constitution and by our community, is our response to that. And so I think that we have a network of victim family members that we work with closely. We often work with survivor family members in our legislative advocacy and different aspects of our work. And I think going in with honesty and recognizing the impact on their lives that crime has had, and also acknowledging that we're all looking for a path forward, I think, has been the best approach for us.
Yeah, I would just add that the notion that being developmentally informed and applying science and understanding brain development and understanding trauma-informed care, there's nothing inherent in that is counterfactual to accountability. And in fact, Carly, Dr. Dyke's hearing, who you heard earlier, is very elegant talking about the role of accountability. It's all about teaching people to be responsible for their own actions. And that message to somebody that has been fundamentally violated, whether it's a kid or even later in life, that's not inconsistent with accountability, right? So that's how I approach it with victims groups, and I also involve them in the conversation, much to your point about youth voice, is having them at the table and really thinking these complex issues through. But I don't personally see necessarily disconnect.
And just to piggyback off that, I think the data shows that there isn't a bright line between someone who perpetrates a crime and someone who is a victim, right? It's often similar people on different days, which side you're falling on in that particular situation.
Hi, Spencer Whitney with the San Francisco Chronicle. One of the things I heard the panel mention earlier was kind of how the rest of the world is somewhat baffled at the way the U.S. commits to their sentencing, particularly giving very long sentences to children and things of that nature. I'm curious that from your guys' experience, what are some countries that maybe have a very progressive approach in regards to sentencing or just kind of dealing with juvenile justice, and are those policies or being implemented here or kind of taken back to be mirrored over here, something like that?
So I'm gonna throw you a curveball right back. Look internally at tribal courts in the United States and how they envision right there. There's a question over there. But envision justice, envision restoration. So there's lessons to be learned right from our indigenous populations in the United States. Other countries, it's all over the map. I'm most familiar with Germany, but they're much more in tune to this idea that you can be rehabilitated and this doesn't have to be kind of a red A stamped on your forehead for the rest of your life. But two thoughts there.
Yeah, certainly, and Vinny spoke to this a little bit, but certainly Western Europe, the maximum term of incarceration for youth is anywhere between 3 and 10 years. I will say it is a challenge to wholesale adopt those ideas here because, as I said, we're, at least in my space, for kids who commit the most serious crimes, we're moving from life without parole to life with parole after 30 years. And I think this goes to some of the questions that were asked earlier. It's a wonderful idea to think that we will never institutionalize any child in our country, but we are miles away from achieving that. And so I think it's really helpful to look to international models to say, other countries incarcerate kids who commit very similar crimes for a much shorter period, and it doesn't impact public safety in a negative way at all. And I think the other thing to look at is, we hold kids accountable for homicide in the juvenile system. So you could be, adjudicated delinquent of a murder in the JJ system, or you could be transferred to the adult system and, charged as an adult for the same offense, sometimes in the same state. And so we can also look internally. So, for some of these, serious offenses, we have the capacity in some of our states to hold kids accountable in youth-specific systems, even if, what we see in Germany or the Netherlands seems unattainable.
No. Here and then over here, yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Latrina Antoine. I'm from DC Witness. So my question probably will go more specifically to Heather. But with your stance against having youth charged as adults, I just wanted to know, has there been any progress towards actually getting that type of charge banned for youth, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, fortunately, there are, we've heard from a tremendous number of advocates today, and we're all working on different aspects of the system. And so at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, we're trying to lower the ceiling, lower the maximum. And then our colleagues at Campaign for Youth Justice, who you'll hear from tomorrow, are working to make sure that no kids are transferred into the adult system. It is like a community of advocates who are trying to attack this from every possible avenue. I will say in D.C., we passed a bill 2 years ago that now all kids get review after no more than between 20 and 30 years, and so those hearings are getting going, and people are starting to come home who, D.C., 100% of kids charged in D.C. and convicted in D.C. are black, 100%. And, it is outrageous. I mean, I'm happy to talk more about the racial disparities at the deep end of the system, but, as we see reforms in D.C. and more people coming home, we have more community members then to be engaged and influence, policies going forward so that no kids end up in the adult system.
Suzette Brewer, High Country News. I want to address, there's a two-part question here. One is, in regards to the tribal courts, that doesn't really apply in terms of criminal convictions, because most of the reservations are under federal jurisdiction, as you probably know. So therefore, when we talk about the youth, in the context that you guys are talking about it's in the state facilities. But there's a disproportionate number of Native youth that are incarcerated in federal facilities that are in a much graver circumstance, I would say, even than some of the kids that one of the previous panelists talked about in northern Wisconsin. So what would be your take on Native youth who are federally incarcerated?
A number of years ago, I was outreached to with a technical assistance request asking if I could find the exact number of Native American, Alaska Native American Indian youth in federal facilities. And we put some of the best researcher minds, data wonks that you can think of. We never could get a clear, nailed-down answer of how many Indian children were in federal facilities. We have, that's all you need. That is about the biggest red flag. It literally had Native American judges, tribal court judges saying, I don't know where my kids are. We don't know. alarming, to say the least. So you might want to add to that. But that's my base point of reference is like, holy crap. Nobody knows?
A similar phenomenon happens in D.C. because there's no D.C. prison. Kids go into the Federal Bureau of Prisons as well. So I think that the notion of being sort of lost is a real one. Certainly there are a handful of Native youth who are sentenced to life without parole in the federal system, and they're working their way through their resentencings. But, Native youth are almost the entire youth population in the federal system. And it really destroys family bonds and connections because it's not like, it's tough if you're from Philly and you end up in a, prison 5 hours away, but if you're in the federal system, you can be, 30 hours away from your family, and it's incredibly destructive.
And your point about the criminal jurisdiction is absolutely right. And I would think even broader than that there's the reentry component that we want to look for at tribal courts and that kind of thing. And we do have some jurisdictions that are experimenting with bringing tribal court judges to co-sit on state court benches for criminal trials. So those kinds of creative thinking, it's bringing that voice that's a fundamentally different worldview to our system of justice that I think is the critical component.
And the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which I talked about a little bit earlier, the reauthorized version would require a tribal representative to sit on each state advisory group, which is a voice that is currently not required on those state advisory groups. There's a lot of different people who are required to be on those groups, but a tribal member isn't currently required.
More questions? Yes? Oh.
Hi, Tessa Duvall, Florida Times Union. So I'm actually from Jacksonville, which is where you mentioned the evac movement with those young men who have taken on this platform of advocacy. And even though they literally do everything right, these young men are still routinely stopped by the police. They've had guns pulled on them. They get pulled over. They have the sheriff on speed dial, have had meetings where the mayor and the sheriff have come and listened to them, and they've made the youth position known, and they still get put through the ringer because they're primarily African-American young men. I'm just curious, what else can youth do to really, be heard and be influential? Because arguably, these kids are nationally known. You know about them, and they're from Jacksonville. What differently could a group of children do to really be heard and to influence the discussion?
I think that the EVAC movement and Amy Donofrio, their teacher, they're doing wonderful work, and the fault does not lie on them in any way if that's still happening. I think it's really indicative of what we see in a lot of communities. When I was doing, public defense work, I had clients who would tell me, I ran because last time I stayed and they arrested me. And then next time I stayed, and vice versa, right? It's a no-win situation. If you run, they assume you're guilty. If you stay, they assume you did it. And I think that's indicative of policing culture and working with your community. And I know EVAC is really trying hard to do that and tapping into some of those other resources. Judges. Judges are hugely powerful. If you can get one of them in the room, that's always important. But I think it's important to remember that when you're coming into contact with those sort of situations, and I know EVAC has also had a lot of funding cuts, but to just, really try to get other players in the room, to try to keep getting those voices out. And they have had a lot of success on that front, and it makes me sad to hear that they're still facing that in their community.
I'm Caitlin Harrington from the Journal in Seneca, South Carolina. The big thing where I am right now is our county just approved funding to put an SRO in every single school in the district. So I'm just kind of curious, and Shawn, you kind of lightly touched on this, but I'm curious to hear what training you think they should go through, how often they should go through that kind of training in order to be positive reinforcement and part of that support system rather than just a negative presence in the school and quick reaction for the youth. So
I might be unpopular, but at some point in your career, you get to be unpopular, I suppose. But I'm not a big fan of SROs. I'm not a big fan of law enforcement in schools. Others will argue with me, and that's great, and it's good to have a healthy debate. What I would say is my approach is if you're absolutely going to do it, Go to the best graduate social work program you can in the United States, recruit people, and then put them through a law enforcement academy. But it's kind of the reverse engineering of that. But in lieu of that, you guys probably have some other thoughts. Obviously, just some training and education around trauma and human development and adolescent brain development, and all those basic things that we're hoping will take root in the training programs. But ultimately, if you're going to go that route, you really want that social work mentality, because they are kids and they have that specialized training to understand that.
Yeah, I would agree. Law enforcement don't belong in schools. It's not what they were created to do. It's not their function. There are some states that are finding creative ways to go about it. Utah, for example, has some really strong MOUs. Philadelphia, they had a law enforcement officer who really took the lead and found creative ways to make sure that they weren't over-incarcerating young people from their school system. So I think if you are going to have law enforcement in schools, which I don't think is the right answer, make sure that they're not just plucked off the street and thrown into a classroom and expected to fix things, because that's not what's going to happen. One of the things that we are seeing, though, kind of nationally from our states is, how do we respond in light of very serious school situations that are emerging, right? And again, I would say law enforcement is not, daily presence in law enforcement isn't the answer. It's finding young people and getting them the services they need and connecting with them and connecting them to, those things that are going to meet their underlying needs.
Yeah. Can I just add on to that? It depends on, I think, I've done a lot of work on policing. I think it depends on one of the things that doesn't get much light shown on it is, who are you recruiting? If you're recruiting guys because they've been in the Army and they've been in Iraq and they come back and they have PTSD, or it's undiagnosed, but those are not actually people who are going to make good police officers. And I think that police officers who view policing as a helping profession, as a guardian profession, as opposed to just throwing in as many people in jail as possible, would really help change culture.
I agree completely, and I should qualify my earlier comments with the two best people I have ever seen work with kids in my life were both law enforcement. So I don't want to cast that wide net that they're all terrible. That if they're recruited correctly, and we have some systems, they look for ex-military. That's what they want. They want the ex-Marine, the ex-Army. Moving away from that, getting to more thoughtful about recruiting, it can't, you can have law enforcement that are outstanding in working with kids. I just want.
On the Oregon ballot this year, this month, next month, there's a question about whether to make it mandatory for police officers to have mental health training. Should that be mandatory for police officers to have juvenile training as well? What do you think?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Question?
Easy answer.
Hi, my name is Danda. I'm a reporter in Maryland. Just kind of follow up on your comments on SRO in schools. So this March in Great Mills High School in Maryland, there was a school shooting, and they had at the time a SRO in the school. So the teenager who fatally shot a girl and injured another boy, when he was confronted by the officer, he committed suicide. He took his own life. And the SRO was, of course, became this local community hero because of his presence there, and because people were worried if he wasn't there, the teenager may do more damage. So I was just wondering, and now actually locally, our local sheriff is running on the platform on adding more SRO in every school, basically. So how would you respond to that kind of narrative that, having them in schools would protect students and make them feel safer in the learning environment?
Real quickly, data, more data, right? There is a huge history of school shootings in the United States going way back before many people in this room were even born, right? So the way to approach that, from my point of view, is to go back and say, look, this was one out of X number of shootings where, in air quotes, it worked the way it was supposed to. It didn't really. I mean, the kid shot himself, right? So again, back to my comment about public education, of folks of understanding, this is not a new issue. There's a lot of debate about whether it's a growing issue. It depends. It depends on how you look at the data. But if you go back and look, that there is some of sort of those foundational arguments you can make that the introduction of law enforcement into schools has not bettered the outcome, if that makes sense.
So the subtext here is that even though juvenile justice, much less criminal justice, is not high on the political agenda next month, stories you write this month, you guys know better than we do which jurisdictions these things matter now. So stories that you run and write this month may have a huge impact on some policy change. How's that for a heavy burden?
And get it done by Sunday.
And get it done by Sunday. So any other questions? You guys, I think, have earned an early break. Oh, we have one. It's all on you, I think, now.
Boy, you are the most unpopular guy in this room right now. It better be great.
And this is kind of expanding on what you guys are already talking about SROs. My name is Mario. I work with Ken's in San Antonio. The local sheriff has recruited reserve deputies as a way to cut funding and put them in rural areas of the county, and so that there's quicker response time, but also a lot of these people aren't on a regular beat. So I guess I kind of want you to glean your interest, or how can we hold their feet to the fire and really kind of just make sure that they're being held accountable and they're not, just some cop that they just pulled so they can fill numbers and they can get a good headline.
I mean, are they volunteers or are they?
They are voluntarily.
With a gun?
Yep. They are reserve deputies who are full police officers with the state of Texas, and they are being used as supplemental SROs in the county for rural areas. This is so that they can fulfill their training hours and also serve as a deputy a police officer as an SRO on campus.
I would, first of all, just check and see if there are any memorandums of understanding in place in your state or your jurisdiction that require that it's a actual, I don't want law enforcement in the schools, but I definitely don't want volunteers with guns in the schools. And so see if there's memorandums of understanding in place, if there's, training requirements.
Background checks.
If there's any, limitations on carrying guns in schools that you could implement with those individuals, since they're not really law enforcement?
They're fully police officers. They are entirely licensed. They're just not on a payroll, essentially. I just think they're not regular police officers in that every single day they have other jobs, and now they're kind of shifting in and.
And if that's sort of the model, I would maybe see if there's any requirements around your EMTs that are volunteers, or your paramedics, or your firefighters that are volunteers that you could also try to put in place with these guys.
Okay, maybe I'll let you guys can have a quieter conversation. So let's, did you want to have something to say, Shawn? Maybe some closing words, if you want.
Absolutely. Just really quick before I forget, my wife is with the National Judicial College, which happens to also be housed at University of Nevada, Reno, and they are sponsoring an event in the second week of December in Washington, D.C. at the National Press Club. It's all about the two favorite populations right now, journalists and the courts. And it's a full-day event. Nina Totenberg is going. My wife made the lovely offer when she saw what I was coming to do. She would like to send each and every one of you an invite to that event if you're interested in attending. I think you'll find it very fascinating, and it is so extremely on point for what you're here for. You're doing. Plus, you'll get some FaceTime with judges in the judiciary. So you will see an email. I saw the contact list. I hope you can join us.
That's great. Or you can send it through us, too.
Yes.
If you want.
Well, I don't know about you.
Well,
No, of course, everybody involved.
I'll try. Anyway, so we'll close for the day today, and we'll be ready first thing tomorrow morning, 8:30 again. But thank you all very much. It was a great day, and really a great way to end the afternoon with some really good, great conversations.